Terrific. My name is Bruce Link. I'm at UCR over here in public policy and sociology. And I just want to thank the people who organized this. I've already benefited from what's happened by hearing Dr. Kelley's talk. It's not quite a white card, it's like a great power. Hearing the people that are out there on the front line is so instructive. There'll be some like overlaps in what I'll say. So I want to talk about stigma and recovery and to give what I call a population health perspective. So my goals are to ask, what do we know about the magnitude of mental health problems in the community at large and among people who get incarcerated? And why might people who are incarcerated have higher rates of mental health problems, or some of the ways that comes to be? And then the importance of stigma with respect to mental illnesses, criminal justice involvement, and other stigma problems. Some of these things from this stigma lens. So I'll go way back to the field that I came from, which is something called Psychiatric Epidemiology. And so you want to try to understand, why do some people have higher rates of mental illness than others, and so on. And it turns out to be a really hard problem. How are you going to do that? Because not everybody who has a problem comes into treatment. So going way back, there were these early studies that tried to go out into the community and identify mental illnesses independently of coming into treatment. And it's a difficult enterprise. Imagine, how are you going to do that? And how are you going to define mental illnesses? How are you going to measure them? And then early on, these studies came out and the rates varied dramatically. How high the rates were and so on. And there's one of the early studies by a guy named Leo Stroll about Midtown Manhattan. And the iceberg's there because his idea was if you only look at the people who are coming to treatment to count how much mental illness is, it's only the tip of the iceberg. Underneath is this large population of people who have mental health problems, sometimes serious mental health problems, but haven't gotten into treatment. And early on, as I said, the rates went all over the place. The profession of psychiatry, though, tried to work on this, and they sat down and they wrote up criteria. How do you define this disorder? How do you define that disorder? And so on. The DSM-3 there, the green book there. Great big fat book, right? Tried to write out the criteria for all of the mental disorders that the psychiatric profession saw. And then it keeps expanding, and you see the DSM-5 there. And then you see two of the people who were psychiatric epidemiologists who went out and tried to assess disorders across the nation in the United States, Ron Kessler and Deborah Hassan. And the conclusions from these studies were that rates of disorder in the general population are surprisingly high. You heard that from Dr. Kelley. That men have consistently higher rates of antisocial personality disorder and substance abuse, and women have higher rates of anxiety and depression. But then large proportions of people don't receive treatment for disorder. So there's a large population health burden posed by mental illnesses, with many of those affected untouched by the treatment system. And that's been true for a long time, and it continues to be true. Here are a couple of the most recent studies that were done. One was on alcohol use disorders. And the study was fielded in 2012, was published in 2018. But this study showed that 12.7% had alcohol use disorder in 2012, and that was a 49% increase since 2002. So it's gone the way up. And the men had higher rates than women, and that this increase over time occurred in all population groups, not just one. And so the burden of that disorder is growing in the United States. Deborah Hassan, from the same study, assessed major depression and came to the finding that 10.4% had major depressive disorder. Now, that's not just feeling bad on a given day. That's meeting criteria, which includes some physiological kinds of things happening, weight loss and things like that. So 10.4% at any given time, and 20% at some point in their lives. And women report higher rates of this. I guess I could take this mask off, and maybe you'll hear me better. Of those reporting disorder in the past 12 months, only about 50% had gotten treatment for them. So that's kind of the background about what exists in the population as a whole. So the burden of mental illness is high in general populations. It's hard to get people from the general population to treat for disorders they experience. What is the evidence about rates of disorder in the criminal justice populations? It's a hard question to answer. But what I'm going to show you is the results from a systematic review. And from looking across all the studies, we can get a sense of what's going on. And here's the person who conducted this study, a guy named Seth Prince. And he found that the rates are consistently higher in US state prison populations than in community populations. We sort of all know this, but he went and showed it in his systematic review. And this is true for multiple types of mental illnesses. The only exception was specific phobia. All others were higher in criminal justice populations. And they tended to be higher for both men and women. And here's the slide that shows that. And each dot on that slide is a study. And the black dots, diamonds, are criminal justice populations. And they're a little hard to see maybe, but the gray dot is community population. And so you can just look at that slide and the rates are much higher for both men and women across all these different types of disorder that come from those big fat DSM books of all the types of disorder people can experience. So there we have that as a set of facts. And then, we might want to ask, well, how does that happen so consistently? Where does that come from? I bet all of you have great ideas about it. Let me go to some generic possibilities. So what is it? I call it selection, that people with mental illnesses are more likely to become incarcerated, that mental health problems produce incarceration. You're more likely to get in to get into the justice system if you have a mental illness, even if you do the same thing, same behaviors. Second would be common cause, poverty, stress, and strain leads to both incarceration and to mental health problems. So you have a common cause, so it's higher in justice populations because they're both exposed to the stresses, strains, poverty, and so on. You could add to that list. And then the third is called causation. The criminal justice context leads to mental health problems, that you get involved in these situations and it's stressful for you, and that leads to some mental health problems. So first, is there any evidence of this? And I'm just going to give examples. And so this first one is, does mental illness lead to incarceration? So I have up there a picture of one of my favorite people, Linda Teplin, who did one of the classic studies of this way back in 1984. And she had people in Chicago, the clinical psychologists, ride around with the police. And they registered every citizen police encounter. And then, did the person have a mental illness or did they not have a mental illness? The clinical psychologist judged. And then, were they arrested? And they clocked what behaviors they were detained for, and found that you're much more likely to get arrested if you were judged as having a mental illness, 48% to 27%. Now that was a long time ago. I wonder if that was still true. So I looked around for some evidence, more recent evidence. And this second study that I have there is one in New York State, where it's a big record study, and it looks at people who were in the records, had a mental health diagnosis in the year prior to being arrested, and then asked whether or not they were more likely to get jail time. And they found that 50% higher odds of receiving jail time when committing a misdemeanor. So there's some evidence for that process. So mental health problems and offending have a common cause. Maybe I don't need to talk to you about this, but in both the field that Sharon, the director, comes from, criminology, and the one I come from, mental health, mental health sociology, both would say, would support this argument, that in criminology there's something called strain theory that says that leads to offending, leads to negative emotions. Those negative emotions make you do things kind of like some of the things Dr. Kelley said happen to people, that could lead to incarceration. And then on the side from the stress process theory that this guy Leonard Perlin put forward, says that exposure to these stresses have consequences for your mental health status. So this is the idea of a common cause. And this could be a reason why the rates are higher in criminal justice populations. Now here, I could use a lot of examples here, but I'll use this one from a person named Jordan DeVilder, who has done a series of studies about contact with the police and people's reports about their contact with police and people's reports about mental health, their mental health at the time. And did this study in New York and Baltimore, and the police contact was strongly related to race, class, gender, and minority sexual status, so it had those patterns. And those who had contact of multiple different kinds reported more mental health problems. So this could be kind of like Dr. Kelley was described really nicely. One of the reasons I like coming after her, about you get in these situations and then what can happen. And then this is examining whether it could have potential consequences for the person who is apprehended. And what you see in this slide is across several different indicators that people who had been apprehended, so on the top left there, this is whether you feel anxious, depressed, restless, things like that. It's much higher if you've had contact and different types of contact with the police. The second one is suicide ideation, thinking you might want to kill yourself, asking people about those questions. And again, those are much higher among people who've had contact. And then also suicide attempts and psychotic-like experiences. So that would be, this would be, and then of course you could think about if you get incarcerated, it's a violent situation, you could be exposed to violence while you're incarcerated. So it could work that way too. So is there evidence for each of these three possibilities? For mental health problems leading to incarceration, for poverty and strain leading to both incarceration and mental health, and then criminal justice involvement itself being stressful and leading to mental health problems? I would say yes, it across the three. So it's an enormous problem, mental health conditions in criminal justice populations. It's a big thing. So what are you going to do? The main point of the foregoing exploration of potential reasons is that it's likely not one specific thing, but about rather many things. So X1, X2, X3, we could list them off as being important. And if there are many things contributing to higher rates, what should we do? So one thing, and coming from public health where I used to be, this is what we would do. We'd make a list and try to adjust each one in turn. We're going to go, take care of that one, take care of that one, take care of that one. But what I'd like us to do is ask, what are the sources of many of these things? Just as a lens for us to think about. Even when we do that, it's not just one thing, but I'm going to emphasize one, and I'm going to emphasize stigma. So that here, stigma could be a source of many of those things that would be in our list, is kind of what I'm putting forward. Now, so stigma, we throw that word around. Everybody uses it now. What is it? And that's why I put up the Rorschach there. People can be anything, sorry. So so I want to talk a little bit about what stigma is in the way I think about it, and then why should we focus on stigma? So here's what my wife and I came in our paper thinking about what stigma is. And we said that stigma exists when the following factors converge. So labeling, a designation, you're formerly incarcerated, you've been hospitalized for mental illness. Those would be labels or designations. The second would be stereotyping. Oh, you've been in a mental hospital. You must be dangerous. I'm assuming you're dangerous or incompetent. That would be the stereotyping element. The separation of us and them. You're different than us. We might even call you a non-person name like schizophrenic or something like that. Us and them. And then there's a downward placement as a person of worth, kind of a little bit less than. And then you could face discrimination because of it. So when those all come together, we think That's where stigma resides. And then we point out that it takes power to stigmatize. It's power to decide what the labels are. Somebody decides that. I don't get it off a tablet from the mountain. We decide what the labels are. Same thing with the stereotypes. These are things that we create socially. And you have to have some kind of power to be able to create those stereotypes, placing people in the us and them categories. And then you have to be located in the places in which you can discriminate. You have to have access to the jobs, the housing, and so on to pull off the discrimination. So it takes power to stigmatize. So that's the way I think about it. You can think about it a little bit differently than that. So what are the reasons I want us to think about stigma for what we're thinking about today? So one is that two of the most potent stigmatizing circumstances, mental illness and incarceration, are coming together in what we're talking about. And the aspects that I just described, labeling, stereotyping, us, them, status, downward placement, and discrimination are prominent in these two. That's one reason. Then stigma allows us to think about the intersection of multiple stigma components. That in the last slide, we had mental illness and incarceration. We need to take both of those into account if we want to think about the problems that Dr. Kelley so nicely described. But also related stigmatizing circumstances such as homelessness. That's another thing. And if the stigmas of mental illness or incarceration lead to homelessness, then you've got another stigmatizing thing to also address. Again, like Dr. Kelley talked about being in the psychiatrist's office when you're in that condition. And joblessness, and then being a public assistance recipient. And then how the experience can be different for those who are subject to stigma of being undocumented or to racial or ethnic stigmatization could also be involved. So stigma allows us to think about all of these things, which all impinge on the problem that confronts us. So, and again, Dr. Kelley made a great set of statements about things. Stigma is a barrier to treatment. We know treatment can be helpful. It can improve mental health and reduce impairment associated with mental illness, but stigma is one of the things that keeps people from getting into treatment and staying strongly engaged. And then a fourth reason that it's important to think about stigma is stigma can harm self-esteem, self-confidence. In some cases, societal views are internalized. Everybody thinks ill of me, and I think that of myself. Respect is diminished, and perhaps one of the strongest expressions of being is a loss of respect for oneself. So when that happens, one of the best advocates for you in the world, yourself, is diminished. And so that can harm your recovery. And then stigma blocks access to key social determinants of health. So stigma affects the chances for education, employment, social relationships, housing, and healthcare. And those in and of themselves are important social determinants of health. And then if joblessness, homelessness, or public assistance use follows, one is further exposed to conditions that are sources of stigma. And now, and this might also have been in Dr. Kelley's talk to some degree, stigma makes effective policy making more difficult because the impact of stigma on the perception of the worthiness of individuals and groups, policy initiatives to advance the interests of such groups may suffer. The us-them aspect of stigma may lead the more powerful us group not to get it wrong about what they need. And that's why an event like today, and for folks to hear things like Dr. Kelley said, is really important so that we're part of the us probably. And she was telling us some about what the they experience. And the better we get that, the more we can make good policy. But sometimes that doesn't happen. And then the person of worth aspect of stigma could lead policymakers to undervalue the needs of stigmatized groups, to be indifferent to them, unless they make a problem. So then I want to do this just a little bit because, why do people stigmatize? And here are three things that we wrote down that are possible reasons why people would stigmatize others. One is to exploit or dominate them or keep them down. Another is norm enforcement, make them play by the rules, keeping them in normative bound. A third is disease avoidance, keeping them away. And people stigmatize people to achieve these ends. So just a few examples. Exploitation and domination, keeping people down. An iconic example of that would be racism, the stigmatization of African Americans to justify slavery and the support of the cotton trade, for example. The stigmatization of American Indians to facilitate the arrogation of their land, taking their land. So that, and then norm enforcement, keeping people in, stigmas deployed to punish people who violate social norms and to serve as an example to all others that they should not do so. Like the Scarlet Letter would be an iconic example of that. No, don't let those sexual feelings percolate up. We're going to slap that A on your chest as adulterer and teach you and everybody else that sees the A, no, you stay within the bounds. An example might be, in the current era, might be structural stigma, banning gay marriage. No, you can't marry someone of the same sex. You have to stay within normative bounds, man and woman. That would be an example. And then disease avoidance, stigma is used to keep people away, perhaps evolutionarily developed aversion to contagious disease, as indicated by skin lesions or iconic example of leprosy, or erratic behavior, strange gait, or weird presence. You want to stay away. So these would be reasons why people might want to stigmatize. So stigma has uses for those who stigmatize, exploit, dominate, control, and exclude. What I'm saying is that as a tool directed at mental illness in incarcerated populations, it backfires and goes and ends up doing more harm than good. That's kind of like the punchline of what I'm trying to say. So having said that's my punchline, I'll give some conclusions. The problem of untreated, poorly treated mental illness is a huge one. It's big in the general population, and it's even bigger in criminal justice populations. So getting people in treatment is an important goal, and stigma may be a barrier. Problem is bigger than just treatment, though. Stigma will likely impact feelings of self-worth, so you can't be your own best advocate. Stigma will block access to important social determinants of health in ways that make it harder to recover. Stigma may divert policymaking away from effectiveness. And then stigma seeks to control, deter, discourage, but all too often it backfires and ends up doing more harm than good. So I advocate thinking about this, using stigma as a lens to have a population health perspective, be part of our consideration of what to do about the enormous problem that we're talking about today. So that's enough for me. I'll go back to my gray tower, but I'm really interested in what any of you have to say.
Thank you, Dr. That was very, very informational and informative. My question is about the data that you collected or had access to that showed harm from incarceration to mental health. Can you share more about what you found?
Sure, yeah. So that's from a series of studies that were started back around 2014 in different cities in the United States. And people hadn't looked at that very often, especially pre-George Floyd and that kind of thing. So this series of studies, the main thing it showed was that people's reports about their mental health, about their anxiety, their depression, their suicide ideation, was elevated if they'd had unwanted contact with the police. Now, there's all sorts of issues that need to be understood in that, like how did it happen? And I thought Dr. Kelley's description of the situations that happened So what that was is sort of a putting it on the map as something that we need to think about. So if you want, I can send you the studies that were done on that. Thanks for the question. I'm not sure I. Okay. Okay. Thank you.
So you said something, and I put a note in my phone because I've never heard it articulated this way. This question, maybe it's opportunity for you and I another time to talk about it more fully, but I know we have some folks in the room to be familiar with it. When you talk about being able to have people be self-advocates, and I like that term, and I put in my notes, how do we encourage healthy self-advocacy? Young people advocate themselves on social media. I'm not talking about that kind of self-advocacy. I'm talking about, I think what you're talking about is when there's a person in a position in which they find themselves in contact with law enforcement. They generally contact law enforcement because someone else is being involved because there's a suspicion of what we're talking about, murder committed, and law enforcement is there. What we see with legal encounters and all shootings that situation dissolves very quickly. From what I've seen in my experience in the criminal justice system, I always ask myself the stability of why there's such self-advocacy or such self like that this happens that the other alternative is you're going to have to go to court and deal with it. You're going to have to so I know that's a problem, but from a more standpoint, we that aren't subject matter experts in mental health, how do we help get involved in helping people in our community have that self-worth and self-advocacy?
Yeah, well, what a great thought you have. I mean, I think you broadened it from what I was saying, because I was sort of saying that stigma robs people of the self-efficacy. But I think you thought beyond that, which I think is really good for all of us to do, about how that could become more prominent. And this is a little bit off what your question is, but we're talking some about having the people who are advocate for the people with serious mental illness in some of the, like where I came from in New York, I did studies of Kendra's law. And there, one of the things that the caseworkers did that really helped the people who were, court ordered to treatment. So we sort of thought, they're not going to like this at all. But often what the caseworker helped people do was to see how they could have this self-efficacy in the system. And when that happened, their concerns about being controlled or coerced went away. So I think that's kind of the nexus of what you're trying to bring up. I think your comment's going to make me think differently, because I'm always, and people criticize people who've been trained in sociology for doing this. They always think about all the constraints on people rather than how people. So I always think, well, why wouldn't people be good self-advocates? So one was stigma, another would be distrust and fear of the police. And if you're in that situation, you might not be a good self-advocate. You may do things that are not. What was it you said? Counterproductive. And you said do the right thing or whatever. Do the right thing when the police stop you. Anyway, I think I really appreciate your comment. Thanks.
I appreciate you characterizing it that way. I never heard it that way, so thanks. I'll keep working on it.
Okay, me too.
I actually had a question. We're thinking and this is probably a question about policy versus kind of getting back to your answer, right? Agency versus policy, right? And so we often think like macro structural changes could make things better for people, but then you think, okay, even if there's a policy implemented to somehow address maybe stigma, hard to do, but if that's not working, so then how can individuals kind of manage stigma? So it's sort of related to what you're talking about,
right? In these scenarios, like how do they maybe not take that on or not let it have these other kinds of negative outcomes on their lives?
I'm smiling because this comes from my colleague, and I know her work, and she's done this fabulous work on people that are in situations that are very stigmatized, but are nevertheless very adept at addressing it and dodging it and resisting it. And I thought too that I was hoping this would come up as our discussion, because you hear from me and it's kind of like, wham, this is happening. But there are chances for resisting. Some of the sharing studies is how people can be homeless but still forge an identity that gives them the chance for self-respect. And I think it's real that and thinking interventions might try to build that in some. So, I mean, some of the general things that are thought about is the rejection of the stereotypes. And you know the stereotypes are there about the group you're in, a person who's incarcerated, a person who has mental illness. They're ambient in the society, so you know they're there, but you say, no, not me. I'm not applying that to me. And it's a little hard to do that because if it keeps coming in at you, it's a little hard. That's not right about me. And I have a right to think that about myself. That just because I've been in a psychiatric hospital, if you happen to think that means I'm dangerous, no. And then we could imagine getting people together to support each other in that effort to say not me about the stereotypes. And then one other thing, I wonder, I've always, especially with criminal justice, and I'm not an expert in this, so it's just to put it out there, maybe one of you will talk to me in the break, is there any way to say, okay, to have a situation where the stigma gets turned off? Okay, it's no longer, you can find ways, it's no longer okay to stigmatize this person for what they did and they've been in prison for. It seems to travel and to go on and to be a punishment that endures. Could there be ways that we help that to mitigate that so that it doesn't keep going on in that way? Okay. All right, thanks for listening.
Well, good afternoon, and thank you to the Presley Center for inviting me to be here today. I greatly appreciate it. What I'd like to do today is just to give a brief overview of what the court deals with in regards to the mental health issue and some of the challenges that we're facing. And one of the easiest ways to raise that issue initially is to talk about the actual part of having this matter come to court. You just had two experts in the field talk to you, Dr. Kelley and Dr. Link, who are very well versed in the area of mental health. You would expect that you're going to get the same thing when you come to court, and that's not always the case. For example, if you're ill and you're sick with a heart problem, you're not going to go to an orthopedic surgeon or somebody who specializes in dermatology. Just because somebody's a judge doesn't mean they have knowledge in all the various fields. This is a very specialized and particular field that you need a lot of expertise in. And we don't always get that when we come to court. San Bernardino is rather fortunate. We have two dedicated individuals who have been doing this for a long time. We have Judge Balderrama and Commissioner Gilbert, who are both very versed in the field, but that's not always the case. And that's one of the challenges that we see in the court system, is that we're asked to deal with situations that not everybody is familiar with. Most judges have an area of expertise, such as family law, criminal law, probate, or civil, and they don't cross over very well. It's very difficult for someone like myself, who has a background in the DA's office for 25 years, with a short stint of about 2.5 years in civil practice, to go in and do a family law calendar if a judge is ill and not available, because I just don't have the expertise. And that's what we're asking people to do in this particular field. We're asking judges to make decisions sometimes in areas that they don't have the education and the background in. And that produces a very significant challenge for us. So what I'd like to do is talk about some of the options that we have and that we've been utilizing for a number of years. The first is mental health court. That's a rather specialized program, and it's designed to treat people outside of being incarcerated. You're basically on probation, you haven't been formally sentenced, and we're looking for community-based treatment options for you. Not every case will qualify. There is a team that will assess and determine whether or not a particular individual, based on all the facts and circumstances, is qualified to participate in the program. The defendant does not have to participate. It's not mandatory. At any point in time, the defendant can change their mind and say, nah, I don't want to do this anymore. No, it's just not working. And the options then are to be formally sentenced, which could mean jail, could mean prison, or anything in between. Again, this is a collaborative effort with the DA's office, the public defender, behavioral health, and probation. And we are very fortunate in San Bernardino to have a very collaborative group. They work very well together, and this is a very successful program for those individuals who are committed and are able to complete it. It does involve intensive outpatient programs, but there are significant challenges that presents. San Bernardino is 20,000 square miles. It's the largest county in the contiguous United States geographically. We go from the Arizona and Nevada borders all the way over to Los Angeles, Kern County. So imagine trying to find resources for someone who lives in Needles or Big River. Most of you don't even know where Big River is. Big River is further than Needles, and Needles is in East Jesus, okay? Needles is an hour and a half, 2 hours from Barstow. Barstow is at least 90 minutes from San Bernardino. And how do you find resources for those individuals as opposed to someone who lives in Rancho Cucamonga, where there are any number of various agencies and resources? It produces a significant challenge. Is it fair to say, well, because you're in Needles, sorry, you know, you got a problem, you got an issue, but we can't help you. So we do the best we can, but we have very limited resources. When we work with what we can, but as you can imagine, it produces significant challenges for individuals simply because of where they're geographically located and for no other reason. So those are what we face on a daily basis. And our county does a very good job at it, but it needs significantly more resources. And I will highlight that at the end when I talk about the new care program that Dr. Kelley initially mentioned, which is designed to address all of those issues with nobody knowing where the funding or anything else is going to come from. Again, the challenges that the mental health court faces is that there's never a cure, so to speak. We're hoping for stability and reduced outcomes. The legislative changes have affected our ability in these programs. Probation used to be 3 years in a majority of the cases. Now it's reduced to 2 years. So we have that much less time to treat somebody with limited resources. And again, the placement and availability of the programs is what I just discussed. Where can we treat these individuals? How can we best utilize the resources that we have? The biggest bang for the buck, so to speak. And this produces significant challenges. And I want to give a shout out to the Department of Behavioral Health, where Judge Kelley, no, that's actually probably a demotion for you. For Dr. Kelley, she spearheaded that program for a number of years. And we had a lot of resources available, but we need more. And that's the challenge that we face. The other program that is used quite a bit is the mental disorder diversion program. And that's highlighted, the 1001.36 is the penal code that applies to that particular program. And that program is basically what it says. It's a diversion. It's a way for an individual to potentially get the charges dismissed if they complete a course of treatment. Again, this is a matter of selection. It is very discretionary. It's not mandatory. There's no statutory right to be placed in mental disorder diversion. You are screened. There's a variety of factors that I'll talk about in a little bit that are all considered. But the end outcome that's hoped for is a dismissal of the charges if you successfully complete the program. Some of the criteria that are required is that the mental disorder that has to be found by a qualified mental health expert, and there's been some debate over, well, who constitutes a qualified mental health expert, but that's for another day. Assuming we all agree that the person that's conducting the evaluation is a qualified mental health expert, the individual must suffer from a specific mental health condition. There are some exclusions that are listed up there: borderline personality disorder, pedophilia, other antisocial diagnoses, but a majority fit within the criteria. The mental health disorder has to play a significant role in the charged offense. You just can't have the mental health disorder and say, well, because I committed a petty theft, now I want to be diverted. It has to be shown that that disorder played a role, in a significant role. Of course, the defendant has to consent, waive his right to a speedy trial, because this program can go on for up to 2 years. I've yet to see one go on that long. They're usually much shorter than that, but that's the possibility. The defendant has to agree to comply with the terms of the treatment. And the judge has to find that the defendant does not pose an unreasonable risk of danger to public safety. And quite often that is an area that is debated. But assuming that the person is found qualified in all of those areas, the court has an opportunity to review a lot more things than they usually do. Usually the court doesn't look at police reports, doesn't have an opportunity to look at the police reports, witness statements, medical records. Usually that's all things that the judge can't consider because of the nature of the treatment and the nature of the statute. All of that can be considered by the judge in making a decision. One of the main factors that the court always considers, and some people have debate on that, is whether there is a risk of public safety. And that can be anything from the individual going out and committing another crime, a more serious crime, just being a danger, being out there and not incarcerated. So sometimes that results in a hearing. Most often it results in negotiations between the justice partners. Again, the justice partners being the public defender, the DA, probation, sometimes the Department of Mental Health is involved at that stage, not that often at that stage. And of course, there are some excluded charges. So the main process is there's a petition filed, there's a request, the judge has to make a decision. Assuming that the person is accepted into the program, can't last longer than 2 years. And again, now we're caught up in the what is the appropriate treatment under the circumstances. And again, that's very resource dependent. If you have an individual in needles, if you have an individual in a community where there are not very many treatment programs, is that person penalized because of that? Do you accept one program that you wouldn't accept somewhere else because that's the only one available? That's the challenge. The challenge is to make a determination as to what that individual needs to deal with, to try to overcome to the best of their ability the issue at hand, the mental disorder, which, as we all know, is often accompanied by substance abuse issues also. So all these factors have to be taken into consideration. And again, all of these factors are considered by the judge in making that determination. But assuming the determination is made, we have to find a treatment program. We have to find a way of dealing with the issues. And that's what's presenting one of the largest challenges. And then, who provides the overview of the program? Who provides the reports? There's been a concern that if it's only the program providing the reports, the updates, the periodic updates that the court will require, that there may be a self-serving issue, that the program obviously wants to maintain clients to come in. They want to maintain that they are being a successful program. So is that the right measure of progress? These are all issues that have to be dealt with and are being dealt with on a daily basis. These are issues that are debated amongst the justice partners and the court. And that's quite often why we want to see the individual make these appearances. We want to be able to assess the progress based on looking at the individual. Quite often in drug court, you literally see the progress that they're making in the individual's demeanor, affect, and everything else. And that's also what we're looking for here. We want to be able to gauge, to make a determination that these programs are being successful and are doing what they were designed to do. Again, as I said, it's measured through the progress reports, but it's the nature and the quality of the reports that's always at issue with us. If there are roadblocks, stumbling blocks, they have to be treated differently. The tendency for most courts in the old school is you got your one shot, that's it. As Dr. Kelley said, you know, just get up and start over. Pull yourself up. This is no big deal. Just stop drinking. Stop using drugs. Get better. You know, why can't you just get better? Why can't you just stop drinking? If you're unfamiliar with the root causes and all the issues, because you lack the background experience and the education, you treat things differently. And that's why it's very important that the judges in these cases and the justice partners all have good backgrounds in education in these areas, because we do deal with them differently. We will look to give other opportunities. We will look to give other treatment methods. It's not one and done. It can't be in these particular instances. And we have to have the abilities and the resources. Again, I keep harping on resources. But that's primarily what it is we have to have the right resources to be able to deal with these issues and to give people the opportunity to succeed. Once treatment is successfully completed, the charges will be dismissed. And that's the end goal. What we hope is the end goal is not only the dismissal, but a positive impact on the individual. We understand that we cannot necessarily cure, so to speak, but we do look for defined goals that have been hit. The last thing I want to talk about is the community assistance recovery and empowerment. That's the new program that was just announced. And I think Dr. Kelley, kind of hinted that, it's great in theory, but we've been given nothing to tell us how it's going to be implemented. A public defender is going to be appointed to represent this individual. Who's going to pay for that, Mr. Sohn? How many people are you going to be able to dedicate to that? Where are you going to get those individuals? Are you going to hire new people, or are you going to steal them from other areas? And do you even know how many? None of that was thought out. Any number of agencies or individuals can refer to this program. So we have no idea what the numbers are going to be. So how are we going to allocate judges? We allocate one in every jurisdiction. Is that too many? Is that not enough? Then who's going to pay for those judges' staff? It's about $1 million a courtroom when you add staffing. It's I think it's 2.5 clerks for every judge because of the rotation. Same with bailiffs, court reporters, auxiliary staff. Who's going to pay for those individuals? Are they going to be new judges, or am I going to have to reallocate judges from other areas to cover this? And then the most important thing we've talked about, what resources? Who's going to pay for these programs, and what programs are we talking about? We have no idea. And while I agree it's good in concept, we're talking about a program that can potentially last 2 years with no benchmarks, no guidelines, and no funding. So that's the challenges that we are currently facing in this regard. I'm not sure how we're going to deal with it. The alternative in this particular instance is that if the person does not successfully complete the program, whatever program that is, that they're going to be hospitalized possibly, or there's going to be a conservatorship imposed. There's going to be a presumption if you fail out of the program that there are no other means except a conservatorship. That's part of the program. And as you all know, conservatorships in and of themselves are a whole new and different animal, especially for the courts. They're handled in the probate courts. And again, I don't have enough judges to hear these. I have no idea what the volume is going to be. But I know right now that the 3 judges I have for the entire county are not capable of increasing this potential exponential increase in cases. So these are all issues that we need to deal with and think about. These are all issues you need to discuss with your legislators and with your respective groups as to how you're going to handle it. How's DVH going to handle this? How are they going to find the program and the resources? How's the public defender's office going to manage this? How are the other justice partners going to react to this and deal with it? You know, these are the challenges we're going to be facing rather immediately. And again, we look to you folks to help us with our resources. You know, the challenge is for the programs to find the programs, to fund the programs, and to see which ones are successful and which ones aren't. And we're dependent on you folks to help us with that. Because, you know, we're not omniscient. We don't know, and we can't say if I take the Mike Ramos program, that's going to be the best program in the world. Or the Tom Sohn program, if you're dealing with this particular issue. We don't have that benefit right now. And that's the challenge for the court. So while I wanted to give you a little bit of background about what the court is currently doing, I also wanted to be very candid with you in pointing out the challenges that the court is facing. We're not able to solve all the problems immediately. We're not able to deal with all the issues as everybody would like us to. We're doing the best that we can, but we have very limited resources. So we're looking to you as our justice partners and members of the community to assist us. Give us feedback. Let us know. Feel free to contact me at any time. And I welcome your input. I welcome your assistance. And if you have any questions, I'd be happy to answer. Yes.
I was just saying, I don't know how I got here today. I'm an outreach worker. I basically work the street for mental health. And I just hope it could be helpful because my neighbor, her son is autistic. He's about 37 years old. And he took the Biden's computer and he's in federal prison right now. Continuously being threatened and assaulted, and he's not getting, I mean, he's in the general population. What's the first step that she could take? She has no idea what to do. But he has gotten his jaw broken, his eye busted, just being assaulted and threatened. Should she be in the general population if he's autistic?
Well, I'm at a disadvantage because I only deal with the state system and I understand he's in the federal system. But obviously what they need to do is they need to try to contact the appellate attorney who's working on the case, if there is an appellate attorney. Look for prison advocates for him to see what resources are available on a mental health basis in those federal institutions. They need like an ombudsman advocate, and there are a lot of prison rights groups that are available. I'm not familiar with them, and because I know there are state groups and federal groups, but that's where I would initially look. I saw one other hand. Oh.
Thank you. Judge Yabuno, you had mentioned that you had 3 judges. Was that the criminal court, or was that, were you including the probate court?
No, that's strictly probate court.
Okay.
The branch that deals with the conservatorship is the probate court. And I have 3 judges in that court for the entire county.
Okay. And 1.5 billion that would be allocated to the courts.
Would any of that go to probate courts?
Well, when they say allocated to the courts, we have 58 courts because there are 58 counties. And we have no way of knowing how that money is going to be allocated or what that money is going to be allocated for. Because even though a county may get, let's say, for example, $10 million, they can't use that money to go out and hire a judge. A judge has to be allocated separate and distinct from the monetary aspect. So the money that's going to be allocated to the courts, however much it is, will come with certain requirements of how it's going to be used. But we know for a fact, at least at this point, that it does not mean additional judgeships. Sure. Yes. Okay.
So we have three questions from folks online. The first is someone has a severe mental illness, she will not do a community diversion program.
How are the staff trained or equipped with helping them to cope with their differences?
It all depends on which particular facility that one is taken to. All the prison staff receive training. I don't know to what extent and what particular areas, but they do receive training. And I know that certain facilities are better equipped to deal with certain issues. So as a generality, I can't say everybody has the equivalent training and experience. It just depends on what particular institution they go to and what particular issue they're facing.
Thank you. Second question, different attendee, is what is the
I don't have that statistic. Wasn't ready for that question. I'll throw it over to Tom. By any chance, do you have any idea, based on your folks' reports back?
So I don't have a specific number, but I can say confidently that the recidivism rate for those who successfully complete a mental health or report is a lot significantly lower than the traditional recidivism.
Do you have any?
I agree with that.
So while we don't have any specific percentages, I think both the DA and PD, at least in San Bernardino County, agree that the recidivism rate is significantly lower for those that complete that program successfully. Yes.
Yeah, so what is the point of this care court to replace the mental health court? Or are they going to operate
No.
as distinct? And what would the difference be?
The mental health court is criminal based. It is in the criminal sector. This care court will be in the civil realm. One of the main differences is the mental health court, if there is a failure to complete or if there are violations, the potential is to be incarcerated for the length of your sentence. That's not an option in the care court. The care court is strictly civil in nature. And that's why the referral is much different. In the mental health court, it would require the district attorney to file criminal charges against an individual. In the care court scheme, as I understand it, the referral can come from a variety of different individuals, first responders, mental health professionals, any number of people or agencies can initiate the care court. The idea is to provide treatment, both mental health treatment and substance abuse treatment, to address the issue of finding housing for these individuals and everything else. It's kind of a way to address all the issues an individual may have without getting them into a criminal system. Anyone else? All right, thank you very much.
think that should be right there. Okay, so we can help this up, and then we'll return with 2 more speakers and a final Q&A, so please come back.
Yeah, about 15, 20 minutes.
Good afternoon, my name is Vonya.
I'd like to thank Dr. Ross and her wonderful team for inviting me out to be part of this exciting
Group of speakers.
My name is Vonya, and I am a native Californian. Came here, so I'm a first generation native Californian, and I grew up in LA. And today I'm an attorney. I'm a founder of a local nonprofit, and we focus on reentry and the keys to successful reentry, including policy and advocacy. We are providing services and advocacy work in Riverside County, as well as Los Angeles County. I'm a caretaker of 2 grandchildren, and I'm sharing that with you because I think it's really important to begin our stories with our assets. I'm going to share with you about my journey, why I do the work I do, but I really am not looking for pity, and I think empathy goes a lot further. And so I'm sharing with you all that stuff. I kind of feels like bragging, but what the heck. So for me, mental health is a personal, it's a personal element. My father was diagnosed with schizophrenia at some point in his life, and he left when I was about 2, and I didn't meet him until I was 40. And I really had a lot of problems with him for not being there, but come to find out, he was one of the people that you see with the plastic bag covered over themselves in layers and layers of clothing that walk up and down the street. So he did that from Southern California, and he'd go all the way up to the Oregon border. Well, eventually, he was taken into care because some health department folks went out and were rounding up people who had been homeless for long periods of time. And they probably added about 10 years to his life. Once he went into care, he called his mother, whom he hadn't seen in 40 years either. And then she provided his number, and we were able to go and see him and spend the last 10 years of his life with him. And so from that perspective, and that came much later in life when I got that, because I had not really been personally touched by mental illness or the stigmas and all that comes with it until I had my own experiences with mental illness when I was in my early 20s. And so I ended up 5150 inside Sybil Brand Jail on several occasions. Sybil Brand was a ladies' jail. It no longer operates. I think they have a Sybil Brand commission now, but that was the county jail. And so I would go in there and come out angry, lots of different issues going on in life, and it looked like mental illness. It felt to me like rage and frustration, but I couldn't communicate or articulate what I was feeling. And so I was going through crime, homelessness, and 5150. And so eventually I began to understand what mental health looks like and what mental illness looks like. And I've learned that oftentimes between the ages of 18 and 24, the children that we raised and loved might suffer a mental health episode. As an attorney, I see it over and over and over again in the criminal court system. For example, there's a young man I know, he's 23 now, but at 18, he decided to go into the Navy, and he left home fine. While in the Navy, completing his basic training, he had a break, and he was diagnosed with schizophrenia. He comes home, mom thinks that it was the government that harmed her son. The police think that this is a problem on our streets, and we need to incarcerate him. And so he is one story of many who we don't have a solution for mental health treatment in our society, and we've grown into believing or accepting that they have to be treated inside institutions, inside penal systems. And it's an issue that we talk about, and we talk about what we don't have to treat it, but we don't talk about what we spend in the mistreatment of mental illness. And so that's what I wanted to kind of talk about today is how do we look at where we're at and be creative in coming up with solutions that we may very well have to build the infrastructure to maintain, to operate, to function, and keeping our eyes on the outcomes of any such system. So in 1980, 1980, a very, very long time ago, Jimmy Carter had come up with this wonderful mental health bill. He actually was successful in getting it passed. And it was the Mental Health Systems Act, I think is what it was called. How many of you heard of that? Probably not too many, because in 1981, Ronald Reagan nullified it, killed it, replaced it, threw it away. So we never really got to see the benefits of that. We know that here we saw mental health systems and mental health facilities shut down, defunded, and we saw a spike in the number of people that are homeless on the street. And now it's become the normal. It's became the new normal. And so in looking at where we're going to go in the future, I just wanted to take a moment to identify how we got here. How did mental health become law enforcement's problem or public safety's issue? How did we allow that? Why did we push for that? And why have we, for the past 40 years, not come up with a better solution? And it's a challenge that we all share. You know, I'm a community member. I'm a parent. I'm system impacted myself. And where have I been? And so it is really with a great pleasure that I'm here with you all today, not to point fingers, but to hold hands. How do we circle up to create a better world for all of us? And I really appreciate the presentations that were shared earlier, and I got so much from them. I'm truly grateful, and we'll be reaching out to you all. We know now that about 1.25 million people struggle with serious mental illness here in California. We also know that we have seen the numbers increase of who in our jails has mental illness, who is being treated for it. So here's some stats. And so sorry I don't have a presentation for you. I am not good with computers, but I did have a presentation, but then I couldn't find it. So I don't know if it's my files again or what, but I do have some stats that you all can check and verify for yourselves. But on the last day of any given month in 2009, there were roughly 80,000 people in jail custody throughout the state, and 15,500 of them had active mental health cases. But then we go forward to 2019, 10 years later, we reduced the number of people incarcerated here to 72,000, but the number of people who have open mental health cases escalates to 22,000 people. And so there are a lot of external factors and reasons for that. We know what was going on in 2019. We know that there were a lot of challenges we faced, more stress, more duress, more violence. And so for a lot of reasons, you know, those numbers changed. The question then is, if we're going to continue to rely on jails and prisons to be the primary provider of mental health services. And I'm not saying this, the Riverside County Sheriff will tell you that he is the #1 provider of mental health services in our county. When we rely on jails to be the solution to mental health problems, we're going to pay more, and the outcomes speak for themselves. If you're curious about what the outcomes are, glance at what the recidivism rates are. Just look at them. There's another organization called Stepping Up, which is a group of people, mostly probation, but other public safety leaders who have looked at what happens when a person with mental illness gets incarcerated. What happens? Well, according to them, they stay longer, they're less safe, and don't have the family connections in place when they're released. And that is what helps to drive and perpetuate a recidivism rate that we can get past if we think about community-based solutions and safety and mental health, behavioral health solutions instead of public safety band-aids that we pay far too much for. In February, the latest stat I have is in February of 2021, 46% of adults in California reported symptoms of anxiety or depression. That is statewide. And so, of course, it grows when you look at who's incarcerated and what they're experiencing. The CARES Act discussion that was had here was very informed and very thoughtful, and I learned a lot from it. My experiences in the courtrooms is that we are already punishing people with mental illness. Yes, we have mental health court. Yes, we have Penal Code 1001.36, which offers a mental health diversion. But it doesn't change the fact that not everyone accesses it or has access to those courts and to those services. We have a racially meted out justice system. And I would not be true to myself if I did not bring that to your attention here, because that's the way it happens, that's the way it is, and that's the way it happens in courtrooms across the country, especially in counties that have reputations for being conservative. And so we really have to look at, where's the data? Who's accessing mental health court? Who's getting diversion? How do we know that it's being meted out fairly and consistently across all lines? Those are the questions I ask, not to point a finger at judges or the departments that they're part of, but to challenge us to really look at things with a racial equity lens that is really going to help us eradicate and address mental illness in the way that we know we can. I heard you talk about stigma. Stigma on top of stigma on top of stigma. And it's very hard, and it is very hard to talk about who we are and what we've experienced in and under the cover of stigma. For me personally, I have to do it because it frees me from the stigma. So before someone else can come and tell you who I am, I'm going to tell you. I'm going to tell you. I have been pardoned by the state of California for my felony convictions. I have been 5150 on multiple occasions. I grew up with mental illness in and around me, and that's the stigma. And so I have found freedom in doing the work I do and telling you who I am, not to be anecdotal, but to encourage the community that I come from to do the same. Stigma kills. Stigma is killing us, and we are dying from it. I don't think there's a silver bullet on how we address mental illness and the intersection of the criminal justice system. I think that we all bring something to our work, to our lives, and to the community. And I think it is in circling up and being inclusive. Don't give me a solution for me. Bring me to the table. Bring system impacted people to the table. Let us help you design what's going to be best for us. We can no longer rely on you to come up with the answers to our problems if we're not part of it. We're in closest proximity to the problem. So we have to establish and engage relationships and trust that will help us get to where we need to go. And I think we're going to get there. What about y'all? I think we can get there. So I really can't add anything to the wonderful experiences and data that you all shared, other than let's be inclusive, let's be challenging, and let's not be married to unsuccessful paths. Thank you.
Oh, sure, yeah, any questions? I'm so sorry. Any questions?
Okay, thank you so much. I have two questions from our attendees. The first is, when you mentioned being part of the solution, what are your thoughts of replacing probation officers with peer support specialists?
I like that. At least when it comes to being peers. And so instead of field probation officers and field agents going out, they be peer support specialists going out talking with people. It's a best practice. It's a proven method. And I like that.
Three more comments. This program works for. If not, what would need to happen to get your program linked up with a program like mental health court?
We're not currently linked up with mental health court. We do receive clients from behavioral health and mental health. And I'm not sure what the process is for being linked up to mental health court. And then we also receive AB 109 folks who are coming home from county probation.
What steps do you think are needed to shift the system away from incarceration?
I think the narratives have to change, and only we can do that. I think there is a narrative that crime is up, and it's up because of the reform that's been happening in California. Actually, crime is up nationally, both in places where reform is happening, as well as in places where it is not. And until we start addressing the underlying causes of low-level crimes, we're going to be talking about the cycles and spikes of the crime rate for a long time. So I think addressing underlying causes and being true in terms of what's happening. I think we have politicized the trends in the crime rate to the point that we're either for or against, and we're going, I don't want to get into politics here, but you know how it goes. So we just have to be mindful of that and think about our communities and what's happening in our communities to all of us.
When you're popular, two more. How do we separate the crime from the individual when mental health needs are involved?
One of the challenges with criminal court and defending
Folks around criminal charges or allegations.
is the fact that we're restricted in what we can and cannot present to the court for consideration. So what we've been doing is creating social Bible codes to try and deliver something to the courts that would help them to see the person standing before them beyond the four corners of a police report or other things that are presented to the court. So I think that's it, and then not settling, right? The easy thing to do is look at the evidence presented and make a judgment. But the question is what has happened here and why? And sometimes the answer doesn't always point us to a long, lengthy prison system.
If a couple minutes to get your additional questions in at the same time, right?
Thank you so much for your talk. I have a quick question about, you had mentioned about the wider community and the policy makers that help and guide a better solution that would be suited to people who are who are directly impacted by the issue at hand, what would that look like in ideal?
Cross-sector teams of community members and valuing people beyond the extent of their personal story, but what else they can bring. I think there's an ethical way to work with people and their experiences or stories. But if we're just inviting them in to listen and hear their story and then excuse them from the table of power that's going to make decisions over their life, it's an injustice for all of us.
Two more. How is the Riverside County Sheriff's Department working with your organization?
Don't start it. They're not.
All right. Lastly then, how can people who are not system impacted contribute to the solution?
That's a very, very good question. And I would say or encourage you to check in with organizations or community members you know of that have been impacted or engaged in the work and ask them how to help. We'd be happy to talk offline to anyone who's interested in doing public safety work from a community perspective.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Oops, my mask is stuck on my earring. No. All right. Thank you for sticking with us. So I'm going to be presenting some research, primarily research that I've done, but also some other research out there in the field. You'll note I'm in Texas. I'm kind of the outsider in this conversation that we've had, but I will note that I lived in Lake Elsinore for 5 years while I attended UC Irvine. So yeah, I do have a California connection. I'll actually show you some data from California in my talk. All right, so to give an overview of what I'll talk about today, I'm going to start off with some facts and misconceptions about the overlap between mental illness and criminal justice involvement. I'll then talk about some community approaches to dealing with folks with mental illness in the justice system, and then I'll end on some ideas on how we might do a better job with mental illness. So some facts and misconceptions. When we talk about mental illness in the justice system, for the most part, our research tends to focus pretty narrowly on what we call the big three disorders. So disorders of schizophrenia, major depression, bipolar disorder. For the most part, if you look at research that kind of uses that label, people with mental illness in the justice system, it's focused specifically on just those three disorders. And as you're probably aware, there are lots of other types of mental health issues that are important to think about. PTSD is a little bit of an in-between one here because in recent years, there has been more of an emphasis on folks with PTSD who are justice involved, particularly if you look at the research on women, because there's a high rate of PTSD in that population. But there's folks who just aren't being represented in the research. And similarly, a lot of folks who are not eligible for programs that serve
people with mental illness because they don't fall into those sort of big three categories.
So now let's talk a little bit about what we know based on research, again, primarily with those big three disorders. So as other speakers have mentioned, there's a much higher rate of mental illness in the justice system. So for men, we find that it's about 3 times the rate of what we see in the community for those big three disorders. For women, it's about twice the rate, but as was mentioned by Dr. Link earlier, women have higher rates of things like major depression already to begin with. So we know this is true. We also know that people with mental illness tend to have negative outcomes when they're in the community on things like probation and parole. So this data is a little bit old, but it is from California, where we looked at rates of return to custody for people who were released from prison. And we found that people with mental illness, particularly those with serious mental illnesses, such as those big three disorders I mentioned a minute ago, they had about twice the rate of returning to custody compared to folks without mental illness. So that's a finding that has been replicated by other researchers. One thing to note though here is that we know that folks with mental illness tend to return to custody and fail on community supervision, but there's actually mixed evidence about whether that's due to higher rates of committing new offenses. That kind of varies from one study to another. What is pretty consistent, though, is that they tend to get in trouble for technical violations of their community supervision at a much higher rate than people without mental illness. So things like maintaining employment and meeting with their officer as needed and all that sort of thing. So what I'm showing you here is some research that has been developed and kind of put together in what's known as a meta-analysis, where we synthesize research from lots of different settings. And this is showing the degree of relationship between a number of risk factors for crime and criminal behavior. So the blue bars are showing basically correlation coefficients. So this is showing things like risk factors for crimes such as criminal associate, so hanging out with other people who commit crimes. As we go from left to right, we kind of see the strength of the relationship decreasing as we go. So the risk factors that have the strongest relationship between for criminal behavior are things like hanging out with other people who commit criminal offenses, antisocial personality traits, having attitudes that are conducive to criminal behavior, things like that. The orange bars are showing the strength of the relationship between those risk factors and criminal behavior for people with mental illness specifically. So what we see are kind of two things, and I think some of my animations on my slides aren't showing up, so I'll describe it to you. But the very last risk factor on this slide is clinical factors. So the level of mental health need for that person. And we find that even for people with mental illness is not a strong risk factor for crime within those folks. The other thing that I want to highlight here is some of those more general risk factors are stronger for people with mental illness. In particular, kind of visually, you can see alcohol and drugs. So alcohol and drugs contribute to crime in general, but particularly for people with mental illness. There's my box. All right. Another kind of misconception that I want to highlight is the relationship between symptoms of mental illness and criminal behavior. So we've already said there's a lot of people with mental illness in the justice system, but the reason that they get into the justice system is a little bit more complicated than what we might assume. So this research looked at whether people were committing crimes while they were actively symptomatic, or put another way, whether the symptoms of their disorder was the direct cause of their offense. And what we found, and what has been found in other studies to corroborate this, is that for the most part, if we're looking at people with mental illness, only a minority of them are committing criminal behavior as a direct result of their symptoms. And that might seem counterintuitive, and I know other speakers have even given specific examples of times where a person is symptomatic. We heard from Dr. Kelley earlier, right, about the person having a mental health crisis and committing a horrible violent act. And that we think is something that obviously that happens, but for the vast majority of people who have mental illness and wind up in the justice system, the symptoms are not driving their criminal behavior. There seems to be a minority, we think it's about 10% of people with mental illness who are committing acts based on their symptoms, and for other folks, it's these other risk factors that I talked about on the previous slide. So why do people with mental illness commit crime? This is a study that I worked on when I was at UC Irvine. And what we did is we had two groups of people who were on parole, who were enrolled in our study, who were matched pretty carefully to each other, so they were pretty similar. And one group, which is represented by the green bars here, had no mental illness. The other group, who's represented by the yellow bars, had serious mental illness. And we measured them on a risk assessment tool. And what this does is it quantifies their level of risk for reoffense based on what we call the central 8 risk factors. And these are the 8 factors that most strongly predict future criminal behavior. And many of those were on that slide I showed you a few minutes ago. So things like criminal history, having problems with education and employment. So this is comparing the level of risk for the two groups. And what we found is that there were some areas where the folks with mental illness had greater degree of risk on these general risk factors. So they had greater problems with education and employment. They had higher levels of attitudes conducive to criminal behavior. They had greater problems in their family and marital relationships, and they had greater levels of antisocial personality. So these are things, again, that are shared by people with and without mental illness. And we found that the people with mental illness had some of these factors to a greater degree. And some of these really make sense intuitively if you think about the consequences of severe mental illness. That can lead to problems holding down a job. It can lead to a lot of dysfunction in one's relationships, and those are things that in turn raise someone's risk of engaging in crime. Okay. Another thing, just to orient you, I'm going to focus on research that is based in community corrections and community interventions. I'm sure most of you are aware that that constitutes the great majority of people who are justice involved. I'm not going to focus on people who are in prison and jails. There's a lot of research on that, and I think they're actually doing some things better than what we're doing in the community, but that's not going to be my focus today. Instead, we're going to focus on people who are in the community. So I'm going to talk about how agencies who are kind of doing things kind of term treatment as usual, how general agencies might address people with mental illness, and then I'll talk about some specialty programs that have been designed specifically for that purpose. So we've already heard about mental health courts, so you've already kind of heard a little bit about what one of those might look like. I do want to point out that community corrections can actually be seen as a great opportunity. We know that there are way too many people in the justice system, period, and no one's arguing that that is a good thing, that we have more people on probation and parole. But we can view probation in particular as an opportunity to try to do what we call correctional interventions. So interventions that are focused on reducing that person's likelihood of continuing to engage in criminal behavior. And we know that interventions that focus on criminal behavior are much more effective when they're delivered in the community. So we've heard earlier, we know that being incarcerated is bad for people. It's especially bad for people with mental illness. And when we're trying to teach someone a new behavior, such as desisting from crime and being pro-social, it's much better for them to do that in the context where they will be engaging in that behavior. So being out in the community gives them opportunities to practice a crime-free lifestyle. So what I'm showing you here, this book, Psychology of Criminal Conduct, is known as the Correctional Psychology Bible, and it kind of distills 40 plus years of research on what causes crime from a psychological perspective. Dr. Link talked about some sociological theories earlier on. This is a little bit of a different lens. And it also talks about what we know about intervening with people who are justice involved. It's not just about people with mental illness, it's more general principles of what helps people desist from crime. And there's sort of three principles that have been distilled from all of this research, and we call it the R&R model. And what that stands for is, one, risk. We want to allocate more resources to people who are at higher risk of reoffending. So people who have more of those central 8 risk factors that I talked about earlier. We don't want to throw a bunch of interventions and services at people who are at low risk, and we certainly don't want them coming into a probation office all the time to meet with a probation officer, because that disrupts their life, and they might make some new friends in the waiting room that we really don't want them to make. The need principle focuses on the fact that when we deliver these interventions, those interventions should focus on the needs that that specific person has that are tied to those risk factors. So if someone is scoring high, for example, in things like employment problems, then the intervention should target those employment problems. We don't want a one-size-fits-all approach. And the responsivity principle says that we need to tailor our interventions to the needs of the individual client. So we need to attend to things like motivation, mental health. We don't want to put someone who's actively symptomatic into a program that has a lot of components that might not be feasible for them while they're having symptoms until we get those under control. So in community corrections, officers are extremely important because they're the ones who are the face of the agency. They're working one-on-one with these clients, and they are the ones who are delivering these interventions for criminal behavior that I just talked about. They also make really important decisions for their clients. So if I'm on probation and I decide I'm not going to do what's required of me, I decide I'm not going to work anymore, I show up and I have a dirty urinalysis because I started using drugs, my probation officer has typically some discretion of what he's going to do, right? He can nicely remind me of the rules. He can maybe threaten me with incarceration. He might have a problem-solving discussion with me, or he might haul me in front of a judge and ask the judge to put me in jail, right? So there's a lot of important decisions that officers make. And officers might have ideas about which of their clients are risky, meaning which of their clients are particularly likely to commit more criminal behavior, commit violence in particular, and this may or may not align with realistic information about those people. And officers are people too. They're members of the public, and like other members of the public, they might have stigmatizing attitudes towards the clients that they supervise. So this is sort of to lay the foundation for some research that I'm going to show you. So in this study, we showed probation officers a description of a hypothetical client, and we manipulated whether we described that client as having a mental illness or not. So they might read about a client without mental illness, a client with depression, bipolar disorder, or schizophrenia. And we also varied whether, in addition to that, the client was portrayed as having a drug use disorder, so specifically cocaine. And then we asked officers about stigmatizing attitudes towards that client. And on this scale, higher scores mean less stigma. So they're more willing to want to interact with that person. So if we kind of take as the baseline this condition here, which is the client with no mental illness and no substance use, we see that was the best outcome of all of the conditions. So officers had the least stigmatizing attitudes towards that client. If there was any kind of mental illness or substance use described, then officers had pretty stigmatizing attitudes towards him. We also asked officers, so if this person were put on your caseload, what's the likelihood you think that that person would reoffend while they're on probation? And again, with the reference, the person with no mental illness, no substance use, the finding here is that if there was any mental health condition or any substance use presented, officers thought they were much more likely to commit more criminal behavior while they were on probation. Okay, so you might be saying, well, you just told us that people with mental illness fail community supervision more often, and that's correct. But I also mentioned that for the most part, it tends to be violations of their conditions. Another thing to look at and why we did this follow-up study is that not all clients are at the same risk level, right? Some people are low risk, some people are high risk, some people are medium risk. So in this study, which was in a different agency, officers had just undergone training on a new risk assessment tool that the county was going to be using for all clients. And that risk assessment tool gave a risk level to each client. So either they're low, medium, or high risk. And that was based on risk factors like those central 8 that I showed you a minute ago. And by putting people into categories, we now know an estimated baseline or base rate of reoffense for people in that group. So people who were medium risk, on average, have about a 30% chance of recidivating. And we presented officers, again, with 2 hypothetical clients here, one with schizophrenia and one without. And we found, not surprisingly, even when we said both of these clients are medium risk, meaning theoretically they should have the same likelihood of reoffense, officers still overestimated the likelihood of reoffense for a client with schizophrenia. And they also felt that that client was more likely to have his probation revoked than the control client. So why is all of this important? Officers' perceptions of risk can impact their supervision with their clients. So this is back to that first study I showed you. We asked officers, well, how often would you meet with this client if he was put on your caseload? And we found that especially for the client with schizophrenia, they wanted to meet with him a lot more. And that could be, on the one hand, if we're going to be optimistic, maybe that's good. Maybe they're trying to be helpful. They want to check in more often. They want to offer more services. On the other hand, we know from other research that just frequency of contact can be detrimental to clients if there isn't provision of services within those meetings. So if officers are using meetings just to kind of check in, they can increase the likelihood that they're going to just happen upon discovery of misbehavior. So kind of the more often you're looking for it, the more often you'll see it. So this is something that can be a little bit troubling. Another thing that we looked at in the second study was how officers' perceptions of the risk of their clients affected how they responded to misbehavior. So we had the hypothetical client and we said, now imagine this person is not being compliant with their probation, and using my example from a minute ago, he's not going to work and he had a dirty urinalysis. What would you do if he's on your caseload? And we found that officers who said, you know what, I'm not going to remind him of the rules, I'm not having a problem solving discussion, said, I'm going to file a violation report and take him in front of a judge, those were the officers who thought he was the riskiest. So the riskier the officer thinks their client is, the more punitive they are when that person breaks the rules. So that's why it's important that officers risk perceptions of their clients are in line with reality. And we know that part of stigma of mental illness is this idea that people with mental illness are dangerous and unpredictable, which can inflate officers' perceptions, and why we believe that they rated that client with schizophrenia as higher risk even when they were told what the risk level was. So to kind of boil down all of that, there's really two things we think are going on that are kind of feeding into each other. So officers have stigmatizing attitudes towards their clients. Not to throw officers under the bus, we find stigmatizing attitudes in the population in general. We even find stigmatizing attitudes among mental health treatment providers, right? Folks who get a lot of contact with people with mental illness aren't immune from that as well. And officers tend to have inflated risk perceptions for this group, and that in turn affects how they supervise them. So everything I've talked about so far in my research has focused just on regular general probation officers. Now I'm going to shift gears a little bit and talk about specialized interventions that have been designed specifically for people with mental illness. So we've already heard from a previous presentation about mental health courts and what those look like. And I put mental health courts and the other intervention, which is specialty mental health probation, as the two that seem to have won the most research about them, so we can draw conclusions, and the ones that seem to have the most positive evidence for their effectiveness. And I'm actually going to focus on specialty probation because that's where I've done most of my research. So what specialty probation is in agencies that adopt this practice, they have officers who are designated as specialty mental health officers. And those officers have caseloads that are only made up of people with mental illness. So those officers only see clients with mental illness. And they're given smaller caseloads than their coworkers so that they have more time to spend with these clients. These officers tend to come into these positions with pre-existing training and interest in mental health, but they're given sustained training as part of their job. They integrate the resources they have within the probation agency along with mental health resources and other types of resources out in the community, and they're trained in the use of using problem-solving strategies. So when their clients are not following the rules, they're much more likely to engage them in a problem-solving discussion and say, what can we do to bring you in compliance versus taking them in front of a judge. One thing I do want to note is that both mental health courts and specialty probation have a huge emphasis on mental health treatment as part of their underlying philosophy. So in the case of probation, part of the officer's job is to make sure their clients are going to mental health treatment. And that's similar to what we see in mental health courts, where judges are very involved in making sure that their clients are going to mental health treatment. So let's look at the effectiveness of specialty probation. So my colleague Jennifer Steem did one of the more rigorous evaluations of this type of program where we selected an agency that had these specialty mental health caseloads and a traditional agency. And the agencies were matched to each other on a number of characteristics to make sure the agencies were as similar as possible. And then clients from those two agencies were selected to be as similar to each other as possible. And then whatever remaining difference there was controlled for statistically. So there were a lot of steps that sort of went into making sure that this was an equal comparison. And what was found was that in terms of criminal justice outcomes, the clients on specialty probation did a lot better than those on traditional probation. They had about half the rate of rearrest within the 2-year follow-up period of the study. So this is very promising evidence for the utility of these specialty caseloads. I do want to mention there are a couple of other studies that have found similar results, and there seems to be a similarity in findings there. So this is a study where we were curious about, well, what do specialty officers actually do? There's this term in correctional psychology where we call it the black box of probation. We don't really know what happens in meetings between probation officers and their clients. So this was a study that I did where we listened to a lot of probation meetings. So officers talking to their clients, and we coded, well, what did they talk about? And what we found is that if we kind of go from the top down, the orange bars represent things that are not really mental health related, they're not really criminal justice related, they're more like social work type topics. So things like, do you have a place to live? Do you need a bus pass? Things like that. So a fair number of the meetings focus on that. The green bars are mental health, and we were expecting that most of the meetings would focus on mental health because that was the stated goal of that type of caseload. So the officers certainly doing that. But what we were not really expecting is what's represented here by the blue bars, which are those criminal risk factors that we talked about earlier. So even though the stated objective of these specialty caseloads is to focus on mental health and making sure clients are going to mental health treatment, the officers were also talking about those other more general risk factors for criminal behavior. So what this means is that it makes us wonder how much of the effectiveness of specialty probation is really about making sure people go to treatment versus working on these other factors as well. So kind of taking a more holistic approach. Okay. So now to talk about some more recent research. And I wanted to know whether there was potentially a downside to programs like this. So we know that they're pretty promising in terms of improving outcomes for folks with mental illness, but is there a negative effect to that as well? And we've heard this term many times today, but stigma, right? So we're labeling people in these programs, and it can be really salient, particularly for things like specialty probation. When you show up to the probation office and you're showing up and signing in to see one of the mental health officers, and everybody knows that officer only sees quote unquote mental health clients. So is there a downside to that? So in the study that I just mentioned, where we compared the two agencies and again controlled statistically for differences between them, we administered the clients in those agencies a measure of internalized stigma of mental illness. And we found the clients within the specialty agency, so those seeing the special mental health officers, did in fact report higher rates of internalized stigma than clients who were just in the traditional agency, where clients with mental illness see just whichever officer. Their officers don't have any special training. It's just kind of probation as usual. So this was something that concerned us. The other thing we looked at here was we asked officers about their attitudes towards their clients. So in the previous research that I showed you, we were talking about hypothetical clients. This we asked about their actual clients, the same clients who completed the measure of internalized stigma. And we found quite surprisingly that if we looked at officers between the two agencies, we didn't see any difference in their attitudes towards their clients. And there's a couple different ways to look at that. So on the one hand, we might have predicted that the specialty officers, they might have lower levels of stigmatizing attitudes because they're interested in mental health, they have more training in mental health, they tend to be really fierce advocates for their clients and feel passionate about mental illness and that population in general. On the other hand, they tend to have more concentrated contact with the kind of the negative side of mental illness when people are in crisis or they're having problems, and that takes up the majority of their day. And we find that people who work in similar contexts like mental health treatment can have pretty negative attitudes about the people they work with. So it could have gone either way, and what we found that, well, actually both types of officers had pretty stigmatizing attitudes towards their clients. So if we compare these figures to what we see in normal population surveys, it's about the same as the general population. So the moral of the story is that officers don't really differ from the population. But what we did find in this graph is pretty difficult to understand, but I don't know a better way of depicting it, and I'll just describe to you what's going on. So what we looked at here is whether officers' attitudes, so again, officers' attitudes about their specific client, whether that was related to the client's report of internalized stigma, and we found that it was, regardless of agency type. So to the extent to which officers are reporting more stigmatizing attitudes towards their clients, the clients are to some extent picking up on that. So this is something, again, this happened in both types of agencies. So what can we do? What can we do better? Okay. So I think one of the more obvious things that we need to attend to, and we've been talking about stigma for most of the day, and I think that we need to take stigma into consideration, both in terms of how people with mental illness are feeling when they're in either specialty programs for people with mental illness, or they're just on probation, or whatever it is. There are some really promising anti-stigma interventions for people with mental illness that can help people to better cope with that stigma. On the other side, though, I think we also need to improve our training and focus some anti-stigma interventions on people in the justice system who work very closely with mental health populations in particular, and make that part of our training. So part of that might be softening some of the stigmatizing attitudes that, again, we all have them, but for the decisions that officers make for their clients, they're so important. We want to make sure that they're not being biased by attitudes towards mental illness. We also could include educational components about the extent to which people with mental illness commit crimes because of symptoms. We tend to see a lot more of those folks in programs like mental health courts, where, a lot of folks are in and out of the system because they're symptomatic and they're getting into trouble. For probation, it's a little bit of a different population. It's important for officers to understand the relative risk factors there. Another thing, though, is kind of more of a big picture issue. So we have this implicit model, and my words are not showing up, so I'll have to tell you what they are. All right, so there's this implicit model of correctional interventions for people with mental illness. And the logic here is pretty simple. So the first part of it is we're going to give people interventions to reduce their symptoms of mental illness. The second part of that is that treatment, that mental health treatment, will reduce their symptoms. And then the goal of these interventions is to reduce recidivism for folks. So that's sort of the logic behind specialty caseloads. Again, the officers are there to make sure people are going to treatment. Mental health treatment is a big component of things like mental health courts, but we know, no, symptom reduction, and there's some research that looks at this specifically, reducing people's symptoms is not enough to reduce their recidivism. We have to look at other things. So Jen Scheme proposed this model, and I think it's a very useful way of looking at the issue. So we really need to consider two different dimensions when we're working with this population. So one dimension is the severity of the person's mental health symptoms and the extent to which those symptoms are actually contributing to their criminal behavior. So if someone is committing a bunch of crimes that are induced by symptoms, they might need more intensive services like an IOP program or something more assertive than just high quality mental health treatment. So I'm not saying don't give mental health treatment to people with low levels of need. They should get treatment as usual, but there are folks who may need greater intervention. The other dimension we need to attend to, though, is their level of criminal justice risk factors. We call them criminogenic needs. So those 8 risk factors for criminal behavior, like substance abuse and employment problems and their attitudes, who they're hanging out with, all of those things. And there are interventions that we can apply that target each of those. So we need to attend to that individual's level of risk on those domains and offer services that account for those in conjunction with the mental health treatment. And it may be the case that if someone enters the system and they're very symptomatic and they're not doing very well, we might need to focus on the mental health treatment first before they're going to be able to respond to the other types of interventions, but we can't ignore those other domains. And then finally, to kind of bring it back full circle, I think it's important that we expand our conceptualization of what mental illness is in the justice system. So we tend to focus, like I said, on these big 3 disorders and sometimes PTSD in determining whether people are eligible for services. There are a lot of other types of disorders that people have that can lead to poor outcomes. We also know that there are people with what we call subclinical disorders, meaning they don't have the right number of symptoms according to the DSM, so they don't qualify for a diagnosis, but they have a lot of distress, and those folks tend to have negative outcomes as well. So we need to attend to that and sort of broaden our conceptualization of what we're considering as mental illness. I didn't put it on the slide, but because it's sort of another rabbit hole I could have gone down, but substance use is also a mental illness, but it's also a criminal behavior, and it gets treated in a very complicated way in the justice system. The majority of folks with mental illness who are justice involved have co-occurring substance use disorders, and being more attentive to that and offering treatment that targets both of those simultaneously is key. So I will leave it there. I'm happy to take any questions that you have. Thank you.
The thing I'll bring up though is
I'm probably wrong on that, but I'll tell you why I'm wrong. Sometimes they don't get things in the company. So some of the antisocial behaviors use behaviors like please build up racial organization. Second, addressing those things, change, but you send that person back to the context. Instead, you didn't worry about, in one instance, but these people will go back out to these where they're fighting off. And so, how do you think about contextual factors in those
Yeah, thank you for that question. I think an important distinction to make is the reason those 8 risk factors are conceptualized in that way is because those are all things that are measured on the individual level, because it's meant to be a model that identifies things about people that make them risky, and then because they're individual level characteristics, they're things that we can then have interventions with, right? But you're right that in particular, the risk factor of criminal history gets really messy when we think about how contextual factors such as police involvement can affect that. And there is a emerging area of research that looks at the extent to which especially people of color are sort of over classified by risk assessment tools because they have disproportionate contact with the police. I've not seen research suggesting that for people with mental illness, but I don't know research that has really looked at it directly. You're right that in the sense that a lot of them, like if we think of the others, like problems in their relationships, that obviously has contextual influences as well. But it's also the case, and I think this actually agrees with what you showed earlier, which is probably the same mechanisms that are driving mental illness are driving these other problems, right? So people with mental illness tend to have a disproportionate level of problems with employment and problems in their relationships, and part of that is the mental illness, but part of it is the contextual factors that feed into that. So yeah, I think definitely, and there's been a lot of attention paid recently to sort of that criminal history variable and moving away from that, which I think is wise. I think as far as the research I've seen, those other factors seem to be pretty predictive back to that meta-analysis for people with mental illness. So it's kind of setting aside why, it seems to be predictive. I think the larger issue, though, is there are these structural issues that disproportionately affect that group that need to be attended to. Absolutely. And remind me of your second question, because I kind of talked longer than I planned to.
Oh, I think you got it.
Did I? Okay. Okay, good.
The first is typically a county spends more money to public safety by way of police and sheriff. But do you think there would be a benefit for us more money for probation or parole to increase the effectiveness of community corrections as the case?
Yeah, it's hard. It's hard. I'm not a financial wizard, so I will put that out there before I say anything. I think it's important that we attend to police. I think it's tough to say take money away from police to put it towards specialty probation. I think specialty probation can be really helpful if the county has the resources to do that. When we did a national survey now about 15 years ago looking for all these specialty agencies, and most of them are in urban areas. So if we're talking about a maybe rural location and they just don't have the resources for that, I struggle to say take resources away from something else, because I think we can train probation officers to work more effectively with clients with mental illness. There's something called the sequential intercept model that has gotten a lot of traction in recent years that kind of conceptualizes the criminal justice system as, a series of filters, and the one at the top, right, the first contact with the justice system and the place where we can get people out is police, right? They're not going to get on probation if they were never arrested in the first place. And I think there's a real opportunity there for, especially, again, we talked about people who are actively symptomatic, people who are having a mental health crisis, to improve our response there. So I think the greater degree to which communities can engage with mental health providers, both to kind of augment the police response to people with mental illness, as well as work really closely with community corrections, whether that's through a specialty program or probation as usual, I think would be very fruitful.
Thank you. Follow-up. Is there a different question? Is there a difference between stigma and experience regarding officer safety? Could officer attitudes also be shaped by intensive crimes people committed on their caseload? For example, an officer being attacked by a former client regardless of mental health issues or not. And they would now bring such a traumatic type situation due to a client's behavior?
Absolutely. And, stigma is rooted in attitudes and experience. So the greater extent to which we have experiences like that, that's going to feed into stigma. If I asked anyone in this room about, tell me about a person with mental illness, you're going to tell me about whatever's salient to you, whether it's a person you know, a person in your family, maybe it's a character in a movie you watch that was very impactful to you. And if a police officer or a probation officer has a negative experience, that's going to be very salient to them. And it might drown out other experiences with people with mental illness that weren't quite so negative, but it can be very traumatizing and certainly can affect how they interact. And I think it's important to kind of process those issues and engage in some education and stigma intervention so that officers are able to not let one negative interaction sort of affect how they're dealing with all members of that group.
Thank you.
Information officers, would it make sense to hire people with lived experience, such as peer support specialists?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question, and I hadn't really considered that before it was mentioned earlier. And I think, there's some of my other research has looked at the degree to which officers kind of see themselves in their role and how that affects how well they do their job. So there's kind of this dichotomy in community corrections. On the one hand, you have to be the law enforcer, and on the other hand, you're kind of also a social worker, and the best, most effective probation officers are the ones that do both. And I would say I absolutely think it would be helpful for people with lived experience to be in that role, provided they're able to balance the firm but fairness, right? It's kind of, if we think about from, not to infantilize people on probation, but thinking about parenting, right? You can be the drill sergeant parent, or you can be the parent that lets the kids do whatever they want, and neither is very good, right? But for different reasons. So we have to be able to apply the rules in a firm but fair way. So I definitely think that there's a possibility that peer support specialists might be able to do that really well.
Thank you.
Thank you. So and all of our presenters are still here. So if anybody has other additional questions for anyone that presented, now's a great time to ask. Thank you.
Thoughts or comments about the other presentations?
Oh, Louden, okay. Thank you for that presentation. So it seems that we were looking between courts and probation in terms of where we might be able to create change.
Are there any studies or any
evidence in terms of the dichotomy wasn't between courts and probation, but actually courts, probation, and community?
I highlighted the courts and probation because for people who are sort of post-adjudication or they're involved in the system, those are the main ways that these mental health type programs have emerged. To some, I haven't heard, I'm trying to think of any examples of community involvement having a hard time. Yeah, there seems to be quite a focus on mental health treatment, and lots of intervention, but
What's that? I don't know. It's
If it was the last thing we might say, I just wanted to say how valuable this has been for me from multiple vantage. But one I'll say is, as a citizen of UCR, and I had the opportunity to be on our looking forward to the university committee on the public good, which is our engagement in the community, and try to think about things that might make us a little bit better than we are now. I just thought this event was that way, and I learned so much about a local context, problem,
having the judges.
have those lenses,
Trump is running a large behavioral system, and then good.
Thanks for that, and I think we should be like a model for what UCR should do in multiple. I mean, we have some, but I just want to bring out.
Okay, so I think we'll conclude that. So thank you again for done. Thank you for all of you. I guess today.
And with that, you all can